going on, guys? TG or Thundergod here with a pretty interesting video. Today I'm going to be tossing each Hokage in Madara's position. I'm going to make them all Edo Tensei. I'm going to just will it, or I don't even know if I can do that, but I'm going to do it for this video. They'll essentially be fighting the division Madara fought as like kind of a round one type of thing, and if they're able to clear those circumstances, we'll put them against the 5 Kage as like sort of a round 2 type of thing. And I think this is interesting just because you get a lot of A character versus the 5 Kage, and I think a lot of people underestimate how much stronger you have to be to actually just do what Madara did to the 5 Kage. It's actually a pretty astronomical gap. So we get to talk about all of this and more. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Now we're going to start off with Tsunade. Now what she's going to be dealing with for this round 1 situation is Onoki, Gaara, Temari, and Sage Mode Naruto. And obviously Naruto needs a little time to get into Sage Mode, along with the rest of the company that Madara was just kind of like ragdolling. There's a few immediate problems for Tsunade in this situation because a big problem that a lot of these Kage have to overcome is that they're not going to have this like giant life-wiping move like the Tengai Shinsei, the double meteor that Madara dropped to clear out the entire division. You know, they're not going to have that. Their attention's going to be split, obviously. One of the biggest problems that Tsunade is going to face in this matchup, because she can do a lot here, right? She's obviously going to be able to, you know, pretty much distort the environment with her large-scale attacks, you know, punch the ground, create diversionary smoke, all this stuff to help her out, even potentially summon Ketsuyu to offer support, which with her acid I think would be very useful in dealing with a lot of these shinobi. But the issue in question is Gaara, because a lot of people point to Gaara's sand speed but actually don't know that, for example, right, he's actually stated to grow stronger after his encounter with Rasa, right? So on top of like some of the impressive speeds he may have displayed previously, his sand and all the surrounding sand is actually made lighter by Onoki, making it so Gaara would actually be able to utilize his sand faster with more amounts. Why is this relevant? Well, it's pretty consistent that Tsunade should be in like the V1 to V2 Raikage range. Obviously not the Raikage with max body flicker, but the Raikage did feel that she was needed in order to stop Naruto and B, and that he wouldn't just ragdoll them himself. She also believes that she can stop him. This V1 to V2 range is also consistent with a lot of characters, for example, like the individuals in the Kage Summit, with weaker characters like the rest of Team Taka being able to combat V1 Raikage. And again, even though she's like slower than Lightened Raikage with her Byakugo seal, it still wouldn't be to the degree that she's like useless against him or wouldn't do well in a fight versus him. She's just not as fast, which is pretty clear. And the reason this is relevant is because Gaara is actually able to intercept version 2 Raikage, meaning that with these added buffs and lighter sand, he would actually be able to tag her and catch her with his sand. Now, even if you argue she's too durable for the sand or like a potential sand coffin, right? That's not what's important here. And I cannot stress this enough. This combo of individuals was actually able to force Madara outside his Susanoo and press him to use the Rinnegan. Now, I know you could maybe argue that he necessarily didn't need to use the Rinnegan to absorb the Rasen Shuriken, since we actually see later in the war he's able to survive it even while having his chakra drained by Hashirama's Wood Dragon. But he did respect the attack enough to think it like needed to be absorbed, or he just didn't want to like take the chance on the damage. And he kind of notices, he's like, it's way too much energy. So it's like if they're able to pull these kind of tactics off on Madara and like force him out, just imagine what they're going to be able to do to Tsunade, you know what I'm saying? Particle Style almost doesn't even need to be in the question because Rasen Shuriken honestly may just be enough. And Tsunade knows like the Rasen Shuriken is beyond her ability to heal because it impacts the Tenketsu. Now, if you want to argue because she's an Edo Tensei here that doesn't directly apply and that goes to the Madara thing, that's also fair, but that would give them a great opportunity to just seal her. And Tsunade is pretty durable. She's tanking Madara's Yusaka Magatana beads, and even though the 3 bead isn't that crazy in terms of what it can do, it's still a pretty good feat. On top of the fact that she more than likely just scales to her own punches that could crack the rib cage, means that she is pretty durable, but this group would actually be able to just force her into a position where that really wouldn't matter. Maybe with the Rasen Shuriken, Naruto also does have the ability to like bypass conventional durability with Frog Kumite, so he can even get in close, and Naruto's no stranger to close quarters encounters. Sage Mode's reaction time is just noted to be above that of KCM's with a wider danger sense, so he would actually just do very well against her in close quarters as well. Naruto has no issues with those levels of speed. And even if you want to argue like the shinobi who are shooting like long range jutsu at them, for example like long range water style, really wouldn't be that threatening. They would at the very least serve as a distraction, kind of like what happened against Madara for like the Kage level fighters to kind of like make that move, you know, make that plan. I also don't need to bring up Onoki and how weighted boulders actually really detrimental to a lot of people, and you could argue maybe he's not able to perform particle style here just due to having a certain amount of fatigue, kind of like he was against Gengetsu where he wasn't able to use it because he's recovering. It doesn't really matter because unless you also argue that Tsunade's like on the same level of speed as Madara, which I mean, I don't know if you really want to argue that, since Hashirama and Madara are shown to be rivals. And a big problem with Madara and Hashirama is that they more so scale off each other as opposed to just like having these great feats versus somebody else. And this is just base Sharingan Madara, so, you know, maybe you can make a case for that. But no matter where she is in this area, Onoki can use the Earth Style Mobile Core to just lift her off the ground into one of Naruto's attacks, whether it be the Odama Rasengan or a Rasen Shuriken. The Rasen Shuriken here also should be effective because even though, like, people cap the third Hokage as having, like, this insane durability, which he does. He does have pretty cracked durability, and he does survive a Rasen Shuriken with the chapter statement being noted the Rasen Shuriken's limit. It still did just destroy his lightning cloak and do some external damage. Pertains directly to the fourth Hokage because his, like, raw physique and physical toughness was what allowed him to survive the heavenly transfer technique, whereas Tsunade was just going to regen it continuously. So it actually does paint the idea that, at least with their base, he does have a bit of higher durability. If you want to argue Byakugo Seal is separate, I think that's fair, actually, since it is an amp. That's fair. It's a forward influx of chakra, along with it being noted to make her stronger and be distinctly different than, like, the base Sani statements that are just made about her. So again, I think that's entirely fair if you go down that road. But you got to ask yourself, is the Byakugo Seal really going to make up the difference here when, again, these people are performing these feats on Madara of all people? Like, if you want to say Odama Rasen Shuriken actually doesn't do crazy damage to her since she can regenerate limbs and it doesn't even break Madara's ribcage like she can. So it's pretty blatant that Rasen Shuriken is just way more required to take down Tsunade. If even that, if you also want to argue particle style Onoki, I mean, that's kind of pretty blatant. You can argue some certain amount of fatigue, and he may not have recovered yet, or like have the ability to use it. However, he does exhibit the ability to use a bunch of jutsu, so you can argue his reserves might have come back at this point as well, which again, she would have no real answer for that. And the particle style speeds are more comparable to like the QB Naruto, and I've discussed at length in some other videos why I think Onoki is just absolutely cracked even among the 5 Kage. Something to note about Katsuyu too, to kind of wrap up this point, because I think it's pretty blatant that Tsunade is just not going to be able to bolo through all these distractions. Even if she does summon Katsuyu, Gaara could actually just use like a sand burial on Katsuyu with like a lot of sand and just drown her out. Unless you want to argue like Katsuyu dissipates, kind of like what she does against Manda, and like separates and reforms and stuff like that. But you kind of get into like, is Katsuyu herself on the same level as like Onoki, Sage Mode Naruto, or Gaara? And is she really going to be beyond like one of their harder hitting techniques? Probably not. Probably not. Her acid's obviously not going to breach Gaara's sand defense. It's not going to be fast enough to really tag any of the people here. So this group actually does have a lot of hacks, even if you want to argue like Tsunade's more on the durable side, and she does scale relative in speed, which Gaara should be above that at this point. And again, you know, it's kind of weird to discuss like how an Edo Tensei Tsunade would be like mitotic regeneration plus Edo Tensei healing. Like, what is that? Is that just double healing, or does nothing happen? You know what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, you don't need to completely take down an Edo Tensei to actually put it in a position where you can seal it. So they just kind of need to do a certain amount of damage in order to kind of stun her for Gaara's Sand Mausoleum. So Tsunade probably doesn't get past this round. If you guys are enjoying the video so far, consider liking or subscribing. I don't know. Let's keep it moving. The next up, we have Edo Tensei Hiruzen. Now, this is very interesting because Edo Tensei Hiruzen is like more akin to like what the slightly more prime Hiruzen that Orochimaru was talking about. And we almost do have a bit of a comparison in how Hiruzen might do in this situation, with him being the only reason the division or the rest of the Shinobi Alliance fighting Giru Zetsu wasn't just like blown back completely, with even the 5 Kage, albeit they're noted to be fatigued, but like the way they're talking, right? Because May knows like, oh, I just ran out of chakra. So they were fatigued, but they did have some chakra to fight. So it's not indicative of a full 5 Kage, obviously, but the fact that Hiruzen's just kind of stonewalling, I think, is very telling. And the fact that he's like doing what he can't do alive, where he's like making clones that aren't draining his life force, large scale AoE jutsu that are like matching the AP of like Giru Zetsu, it's pretty cracked. It's pretty cracked. I am also of the opinion that Hiruzen scales above the Sannin tier. Bare minimum, he's relative, but in this state, because he lost all the restrictions and afflictions he did have, he should scale above it with this like more, I don't want to say more prime version, but more indicative to what a slightly more prime Hiruzen would be. I think if you argue they're just like blatantly relative, or you know, he just scales like directly to the Sannin and not above, you're kind of missing like the whole idea with like Hiruzen versus Orochimaru. You're not looking at that fight with like case by case. You're kind of looking at generalization. Yes, there's mental afflictions on both sides. Yes, you could maybe argue like Hiruzen had some mental amp like mid-fight. Something that might point to like this Hiruzen being more comparable to the like more, you know, Sage Mode variants, or like the Sannin in their higher stages is the chapter 375 synopsis statement that talks about Jiraiya's skill, the strongest summoning team, and it's like an exclamation point, a question mark, which is interesting when you also note that Hiruzen and Enma kind of work as partners and are also a summoning team, with Enma being noticed the strongest summon, which maybe could imply it. We do know like Sage Mode Jiraiya it is like completely different from all the Sannin statements because he knows like I'm gonna move beyond the Sannin. But even then, it's like a question mark and an exclamation, so it almost like kind of raises the question as opposed to being this objective statement. Something else I want to note about Hiruzen too is that the thing everybody brings up with him knowing all existing jutsu in the leaf, this is actually a mistranslation. For those who don't know, the actual translation is closer to Hiruzen knowing the existence of all jutsu, or just like having knowledge about all jutsu, like studying all jutsu, as opposed to him actually being able to perform every single jutsu in the leaf, which actually fits a lot better with like his nickname as the professor. And this does, you know, obviously this doesn't mean that he's going to be able to do all the, you know, jutsu exclusive to clans, but it's still a good note for his arsenal because it just means he has like a large repertoire of knowledge and is pretty, you know, formidable in a lot of situations because he does have knowledge about all these jutsu. Ibisu also just stating that Hiruzen knows 1,000 illusionary techniques, or he's skilled at 1,000 jutsu, which again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying, to where he's kind of very similar to Kakashi, where like he's this jack of all trades. You know, Naruto compares Kakashi to like having better smell than Kiba, smarter than Shikamaru, you know, better than Taijutsu than Lee, you know, all this stuff. So I think that kind of extends to Hiruzen with him just being this jack of all trades, knows a lot of techniques, has a knowledge on most techniques, and it just makes him this pretty significant fighter. So he's not pulling out Rasengans at FTG probably, but you could say he knows about those techniques and maybe would have some countermeasures ready. So that kind of, I kind of discussed that because that kind of does impact how we talk about Hiruzen. Now, getting into the matchup, I definitely see Hiruzen just making like, you know, we don't know the max amount of shadow clones he can make, but we'll just use 4 as the benchmark since that's what he does in the fight against Girugiruzetsu. He makes 4 shadow clones and just goes long range, aping the Shinobi Alliance. And even if you argue they counteract like his fire style with his water style, he's going to be hitting all 5 elements through that water style, so it really wouldn't work. And this is actually really in character for Hiruzen to use shadow clones, like Orochimaru and the Anbu noted. So him doing this is very like run-of-the-mill in my opinion. I would actually make the case that Hiruzen's fire style puts Madara to shame. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, but when you actually get into the statements made about his fire style Dragon Flame Bombs, they're pretty intense. Noted the strongest of all fire style ninjutsu. You can actually make a pretty good case for the Sarutobi clan just having better fire style than the Uchiha clan. Since their fire style just has better statements to it, it's just noted to reduce the target to ash, whereas techniques like Madara's fire style, Great Fire Destruction, are just noted to destroy everything. So, I mean, it just kind of sets a really good precedent for Hiruzen's like AP, especially with his fire flame bombs. And this isn't, if you want to say like, oh, maybe you're reaching or something like that, the data book also supplements this with, even among the jutsu mastered by the third, this one has outstandingly great power he is proud of. So even among his vast repertoire of jutsu, this one has outstandingly great power he is proud of. Enma is also going to be pretty pivotal here since it's just kind of like support for Hiruzen, and Enma should be fine against these random blades since it's only really noted to be hurt by the Kusanagi blade. So Hiruzen would just be winning in these elemental clashes and just dominating a lot of these shinobi with shadow clones. Now, obviously, the big trouble comes in with, like, Sage Mode Naruto. You know what I mean? Like, how does that kind of go? This is where Hiruzen's going to struggle because kind of, like, not so similar to Tsunade, but you can make a case, like, his durability isn't quite as high, and he may not have an answer to like the Rasen Shuriken or Odama Rasengan respectively if they come his way. A good way I could put it that I brought up before is that Hiruzen does react to 2 levels of acceleration by Jubito. One, Jubito is like consciously zooming at him, so there's no real arguments that he's standing still or anything like that. And then uses the true Singing Orb, which is a bit slower than he is, but it, you know, pushes that on top of his acceleration. So you have to ask yourself, are any of these attacks actually going to be that fast as well? So here you can make a case Hiruzen may be able to like mitigate the damage on some front, maybe use Enma to like push himself out. The upper limits of Enma's extension are also pretty impressive by the anime standards by pushing the Nine Tails out the village. In the manga, it's more of a team effort, but this would also set a pretty good precedent since he would just be able to like kind of twirl it around, maybe push himself out of some damage. The bigger issue here for Hiruzen is, again, like those team combination attacks that are going to be pretty difficult for him. The Light and Sand's going to be pretty threatening to him as well. Even if you go off like his reputation as the strongest of the 5 Kage, you could argue Kabuto's basing that off of like the Prime Hiruzen or like the more Prime one that was fighting the Nine Tails. But that version, or like one that was like 10 years younger, would be more akin to like the Edo Tensei version, as opposed to just being like this completely different tier of fighter. I think Hiruzen's really good for just, you know, taking down and mowing down all these like large groups of shinobi. He'll just struggle with getting grabbed by the sand. Obviously, clone feints exist. Maybe he could swap himself with a clone or something to that degree. If you also assume he can make more clones than the 4 he made, that would also just put him in a very good position. You'd have to argue he just goes for like the takedown on Naruto and co, like very early on with like some of his harder hitting jutsu, or just beats them down with Enma, because it is noted that Hiruzen's taijutsu in close quarters, he's just kind of a completely different animal. It's kind of a tough situation, right? Because again, like, what does Hiruzen really have if he gets grabbed? The problem is, if you get grabbed in this situation, you're cooked. But at the same time, right, this is also a shadow clone of Naruto, so it actually wouldn't require that much for Hiruzen. We kind of was like establishing some stuff with his AP. He actually should be able to take it down. And if you do argue he actually does take out the Naruto shadow clone, that's kind of cooked. I actually don't think the Alliance would be able to do anything, since it's pretty implied that Onoki can't use particle style here, since he's, you know, a bit fatigued again. And the reason I say this is, if he could have, he probably would have against Madara Susanoo. He didn't know Madara had the Rinnegan at that point in the series. So the name of the game is kind of if Hiruzen can kind of get close enough with Enma to really just kind of, well, batter everybody around. And again, Enma can actually support him and probably like push him out of sand attacks and stuff like that, as its extension is pretty crazy. Enma himself can like pop his head and arm out of the staff. So I think you could make a case like Adamantine Yui would be very useful here. So there are actually a lot of different ways Hiruzen could pull off a W in this situation. You could argue he uses water style to lessen the sand's density, making it easier to like break out of that with like one of his clones, or like shoots that out. So he kind of does have options even with the sand stuff that I argued earlier. And again, if that shadow clone kind of dips, it's kind of cooked. Hiruzen should just scale also above everybody here individually. If not due to his statements, but also just like his feats in the war, just put him a pretty distinct tier above everybody here. Another good example for like Hiruzen stuff is that the tandem paper bombs go off. Naruto's kind of disoriented and confused on what's happening. Sasuke kind of has to chide him. And Hiruzen and like Tobirama, Minato, they're all instant to react and stuff like that. So he's also just relevant against like a 10-tail spider and the strategies being employed there as well. So I think you can make a good case. Granted, it is kind of debatable. I think I'm going to give Hiruzen the pass to round 2, just due to the fact he has the AoE scaling, potential stats, close and long range abilities here that kind of give him the perfect edge, along with not really going to be playing around as much as Madara did. Like, Hiruzen's not really that type of fighter. That's more of like a Madara thing. I'll also add that Kurama is not going to give Naruto chakra here, because he's not going to feel like motivated to, because it's Madara. You know what I'm saying? That was the whole deal with the first time around. Kurama detested Madara way more than Naruto, so he obviously just gave Naruto chakra, and he was coming around to Naruto at that point anyway. So that would never happen, and, you know, the clone would go poof. Obviously, Tamaru's not going to be that useful. So I actually do think this one warrants enough debate to where I'm just going to pass Hiruzen through, and we'll get into Hiruzen versus the 5 Kage. Now, Hiruzen versus the 5 Kage is a lot more of a different discussion, because the feats of like him outperforming them are like when they're all fatigued. You have a Sannin type fighter who, you know, you can maybe argue is comparable among them. Although I do stand pretty firmly on like the Hiruzen greater than the Sannin. Now, the thing about the Gokage is that that's a very tough tier to be objectively above. Like, there's a few like benchmarks that discuss this. One of them is Kinkaku and Genkaku, and how with all 5 of like the 6 Pat's ninja tools would grant them power greater than the 5 Kage, which, if you know about those abilities, they're insanely broken. So that's kind of like one benchmark we have. Another is Guy in the 8th gate, which grants powers tens of times greater than the Gokage. But again, this is just such a far out example, and like more of like a 6 paths kind of character, that it also doesn't really work. Madara's character also can't be overstated in his fight with the Gokage, because he's letting them get away with a lot. Now, I'll say this. There are some things that Hiruzen just loses to, right? Let's start with that. There are some things that he just loses to. Onoki's amped like particle style via Tsunade wipes. Doesn't matter what Hiruzen really has. It would just one-shot all of his shadow clones if he made them in the fight. That's a pretty blatant one. Light and Raikage would also be pretty difficult, since we don't know if the Raikage is actually using body flicker with Onoki on his back. It's not really displayed, but I think you could make a case for it, which, if that's the case, it actually might be cooked for Hiruzen, since that would be way above any speed that he's maybe been exposed to. I will also note that the Gokage's teamwork is pretty cracked at this point. And the fact that Hiruzen really can't absorb particle style is actually a big issue for him, because particle style is what was really doing damage to a lot of Madara's attacks. You know, the Hashirama's like wood pollen jutsu that completely got negged by particle style. You got the Juggernaut Tsunade, who's just gonna regen from everything. Nothing Hiruzen has actually would really put down Tsunade, which is interesting. And not too many people bring up the fact that Tsunade actually out-staminas the Raikage in this fight, because she keeps the Byakugo seal and continues cellular division throughout the whole duration. After she activates it once, she maintains that for the whole time, the rest of the fight against Madara's Wood Susanoo clones. But the Raikage during that fight is constantly turning on and off his lightning cloak. So she's even like making the Raikage kind of look bad in terms of stamina reserves. Not that the Raikage isn't a juggernaut too, he's comparable to like the full 8 tails, but I'm just saying like it's just a good feat for Tsunade. The Senju are known for this. Now, even if Hiruzen does make shadow clones for each of the Kage, we don't know the upper limits of how many he could make, and we already saw that the Kage were also able to do really well against Madara's wood clones. Granted, again, he's playing around. But you have to ask yourself, are these shadow clones that are weaker than the original gonna just be like bodying each of the Kage with their jutsu? Probably not. Tsunade's probably not getting just obliterated by a Hiruzen shadow clone. I think that's a little disingenuous. Same thing with the Raikage as well. Granted, something cool that I could see with the shadow clones is that they all could use the same jutsu to just like create this big ass amplified jutsu, like a giant fire style flame bomb. But again, right, particle style just hard counters that so much, and the fact that Hiruzen really doesn't have an answer for that is pretty telling. And I think you can make a very good case, and it's pretty supported, that Hiruzen is above any of these Kage individually, but together you can't really argue he'd be able to just perform and lackadaisically move around kind of like Madara did, just because even at certain points in the fight, Madara was forced to, you know, undergo a doppelganger. You know what I'm saying? Like, he was forced to unleash his full power when their teamwork was kicking in. So it's like, if they actually do catch him lacking with some strategies, it can be pretty detrimental. And I don't think he scales that far above them individually to where he can just walk in and clap them all up like that. Long range hit and miss that's corrosive is also going to be pretty detrimental to him and Enma, which is also something you have to consider. Even if Enma pops out, it's not like he's going to be that relevant here either. And Tsunade could always summon Ketsuyu here as well to aid her. She didn't in the Madara fight, but that's because Madara was just so much stronger, it didn't really matter. So while Hiruzen does perform this feat that's like greater than the 5 Kage, I do want to make it noted that that's more of like a fatigued 5 Kage than what we're seeing here against Madara, which is done at like full power, or, you know, much closer to full power. And that with these Kage being able to perform these like combination moves, whereas against Giru, they weren't able to do any of that. You know what I'm saying? There wasn't really that ability to do that. They're more so stretched thin. So for all these factors, you know, looking at the scaling and the ability wise, there's nothing that really says like Hiruzen would be able to just kind of like do what Madara did against the 5 Kage, or just be able to like take them down instantly with Enma. At some point or another, he would get sealed by a Grand Mausoleum, or just put into a position where he takes enough damage to where he can get sealed. Like, Gaara into Tsunade's punches is all you really need. And again, right, even if you don't argue that, you could argue maybe they grab Enma, seal him, and then seal Hiruzen after, which would be a huge restriction on him. He just lost like his main way of fighting, or a main way of fighting. So again, right, they have all this stuff going for them. Weighted boulder. It's just like, yeah, Hiruzen would probably just overwhelm them blatantly individually, but here, that's just not apparent. I don't think that would be the case. I don't think his shadow clones are making up more of the difference. And listen, I think if each Kage is able to at least survive against Wood Susanoo clones, I think you could make a valid case they would also do well against Hiruzen shadow clone. I don't think that's a stretch by any imagination. Even if you argue Madara is sandbagging, we do see that the Susanoo clones are going after the Kage like they're trying to win a fight, stabbing through Tsunade, putting the Raikage under Genjutsu, you know, trying to slash down the Mizukage and Gaara. So it's like, you know, for all these reasons, I don't think Hiruzen clears round 2. I'll make an extra note here for Prime Hiruzen. If you give me like a Prime interpretation, I think Prime Hiruzen would wash pretty, you know, confidently. Even if you take the statements about him being stronger than like, or the strongest Hokage at face value, you could actually assert that may just put him above like base Hashirama, since most people wouldn't have seen his Sage mode. I just thought I'd throw that in since, again, we're using like a revived old man version of Hiruzen and not like the strongest version of him. So, you know, to be fair, I do think Prime Hiruzen would actually clear this, since he's kind of in that similar ballpark. Next up, we have Tobirama. Now, unlike Hiruzen, Tobirama does, you know, have some better scaling, arguably, or at least the Edo version of it. Now, the thing about Tobirama, you know, people are just, you know, scaling him like wherever, you know, 5 times faster than Jubito, blitzing him sub Tsunade level. I don't know. People say whatever. I will say this. In terms of reaction speeds and like the ability to move, he should scale to the EMS Sasuke and KCM Naruto, like the more mastered KCM Naruto that were fighting against Obito, since those like speed ranges and the way he was fighting was deemed very fast by Minato and, you know, Naruto himself. And he's able to like FTG and react and intercept those types of characters' attacks. So, you know, that's where he would be. And that would also just pretty much scale objectively above everybody who would be like in these gauntlets. And that is me being conservative with Tobirama. If you want to say he scales relative to Jubito, maybe you argue he's fluctuating. Maybe you argue it's not even him running forward. He's just kind of like stationary. Whatever you want to say, doesn't really matter. I think that's also fair. I just do want to note that I know people get contentious about Tobirama and Minato scaling by extension. So yeah, even at one of his lowest interpretations, he would just still bypass all of this. Tobirama main character is flooding this battlefield full of water. Let's just start with that. His anniversary guide statements point to this. He's going to create large-scale tsunamis. He's going to do what Kisame blatantly does and just pretty much flood the battlefield, which is going to make it difficult for this group to actually get that advantage with the environment that I was mentioning before, because Tobirama is essentially going to force this fight into an area where he excels, not everybody else, with like water dragons and whatnot. None of the shinobi should really be able to stop this. I'm not going to lie, unless you argue that they somehow cancel out his water style. And even then, you could just argue like he just shoots it down and not directly at them like Madara did with the fire style. In this situation, it's actually very easy to just say he would actually just dart around and take out these clones and fighters. Again, Gara-san's density is going to be weakened in the water, so it won't be as effective. It's not going to be to the same degree as Gengetsu, since his water is closer to oil, which hard counters Gara, but it would have an effect. Tobirama would obviously have FTG, and although he's not going to have like standardized markings like ready to throw all over the battlefield like Minato, he can throw it on kunai and can throw it on shinobi throughout the battlefield, which would allow him to just kind of dart around and pretty much make it that he can't be sealed. Once you have an FTG marking, you can literally just teleport to it even after you're like the sand is forming around you, unless you're like Edo Tensei is just taking damage. So it's pretty much gonna make it that he has free reign. You know what I mean? There's not really going to be too much of an issue for Tobirama here. You're dealing with a fighter that Madara respects. You know what I'm saying? This is quite, you know what I mean? Like, this is the same dude who in close quarters can like dart around with Sage Mode Rinnegan Madara. You can argue that in counter maybe. But listen, even if you don't think Tobirama scales that high, the fact that Madara perceives him as a threat, even with Tobirama's like kind of MO of striking people off guard, he doesn't really like, you know, relax around Tobirama after Rinnegan rods are impaled in him. It just kind of, you know, it just paints a good picture for him. And again, the scaling is there to kind of suggest that unlike the like maybe Tsunade or Hiruzen, where you can maybe argue one way or another, Tobirama with the speed is just kind of cracked. I also do want to note that tandem paper bombs is valid. Now, if you go with the higher interpretation of tandem paper bombs and do say they scale to a 10 tails Bijou bomb, and I will say this is debatable. I'm not going to sit here and just say it's like output, but I do like this interpretation. I will go with it for the video. This also just clips everybody here. No one's really going to be able to defend about it. He's just going to poke a hole in his chest. They're going to go off. Gara-san really wouldn't be able to defend against it. It would just kind of be like a 1 and 2 kind of done and done. And again, this is consistent with Tobirama's like data book. You know, the statements he makes about it. It's kind of meant to be this like no one survives the technique, even him type of deal, which is why I don't necessarily subscribe to him FTG marking out of the technique. If Tobirama obviously makes shadow clones, this would help him out, as he could also place marks on his shadow clones. So he's just in a really good situation to say like none of these guys get their win conditions off. Like once the Naruto clone falls, it's good. He really shouldn't have too many problems with the shinobi kind of mucking about and stuff like that. And even if he did get caught in a situation to where he was grabbed by Gara-san or put into like a position where he's going to get hit by one of Naruto's attacks, he will be able to react and FTG out of it, show the reaction feats. Just pretty standard stuff for the Tobirama side, nothing new. I think he clears this round. Next up, we have Tobirama versus the 5 Kage. Now, this is very interesting because I think in this type of situation, the biggest question you need to ask yourself is, because Tobirama has ways to avoid a lot of what the 5 Kage do. Unless you argue like an amped Onoki particle style, again, that would just like eliminate a lot of Tobirama's range unless he plays like, he puts a mark that far away or just places it somewhere that far in the battlefield. He's actually just going to get caught in the blast and won't be able to teleport out. I think the biggest question is Tobirama's AP here, because that's probably going to present the most issue, because his water style, for better or worse, we don't know how strong it is. We really don't. Like, you can say Madara blocked his water Senbon, But we also know Madara is just being careful and in character prefers to just block things with this Susanoo. So it just kind of creates this issue where we don't know if, like, for example, his water style would just be able to bypass Tsunade's insane durability, the Raikage's, for example, with his lightning cloak. It would just create these issues. So it's like, even though he's faster, it would just be this like problem where, like, okay, he might have to just like rely on tandem paper bombs here. And if you go off the idea that tandem paper bombs do scale to like the deity gate that wasn't destroyed by the Ten Tails bomb, and to like argue devil's advocate, the reason I say it could be argued to be debatable is because the way the data book like discusses the deity gate is that it matches whatever's under it and pours chakra into whatever's under it, like, you know, changing its properties to that. So you can make a case that they really only scale and upscale in durability when something is actually under it, which the Ten Tails was when it fired the Ten Tails beast bomb. Now, that's one interpretation. I'm just playing devil's advocate. If you go with the higher one, you can make a valid case that if Tobirama actually does get close enough, does get an FTG marker in, he could tandem paper bombs, and that would be the end of the 5 Kage. If you don't go off that interpretation, it becomes that much more of a harder fight for Tobirama because it's a bit of like a dinosaur in the fly situation where he's almost going to have to like out attrition the 5 Kage or just like pick off some of the weaker members like Mei first. And that's going to be very difficult, especially since Tsunade is a medic. She can also summon Katsuyu to start healing them if Tobirama's water style does do damage. And you gotta have to argue, like, because unlike Onoki before, where it was like, okay, is he so fatigued to use particle style? Here, this dude's spamming it, bro. He is throwing that shit out left and right. So, particle style here, that would also be a hard counter to a lot of Tobirama's water style. And even if he floods the area, Onoki would just tear the water style down to the molecular level, completely destroy it like it did the pollen in the air, which creates this very difficult situation for Tobirama. I think one of the better arguments here is that he makes shadow clones and attempts to mark any of the Kage individually and tries to do what he does in character, which is, you know, the whole narrative behind Tobirama is that he pretty much makes his opponents like think they've won and just off guards them or hits them with some slick shit after, which again is just like is just his MO. So I think in character we probably try to do a similar thing here, bait the Kage into think they've won, maybe try to get an FTG seal on one of them, pop back in, tandem paper bomb himself, and go for the W. But I do think this is kind of debatable, even though he has the speed for it. He has to get himself in. I will say this too. I do not go under the interpretation that Tobirama can use tandem with shadow clones. I know some people fall into that interpretation. It's never implied. The data book nor series implied it. If he could have, it would never be noted like it is to be this technique no one can escape. It's also pretty implied, at least in my opinion, that instead of like a replicating tag, it uses the Edo Tensei body itself as a fuel for tags. But I'll put it like this, right? Let me put it like this, because it's kind of see how the fight I could see it going. Tobirama may actually just let himself get ran through, pause, in order to actually place a mark on any of the Kage like he does against Jubito. Then proceed to start just throwing out these paper bombs, use the Edo Tensei. And I will say, you either argue that Tobirama like has like this infinite supply of exploding tags that spawn, or the tags utilize his Edo Tensei body as a medium to like pretty much invoke more of them. It doesn't really matter. The point is though that I think this is an in-canon win condition that he can get off. The stats are certainly there, like all of his stats are certainly there. It's just kind of like how you interpret tandem. And if you don't though, this becomes a much harder fight where it's actually a lot feasible for Tobirama to lose just because he would actually not have strong enough jutsu to put a lot of these Kage down, unless you argue he maybe drowns them out. Regular kunai are obviously not going to be that detrimental to them. His water style isn't that crazy. And if anybody brings up how he severed a god tree, like 40 other characters have done that. I'm not hearing that. Killer B literally cuts the branches down with Samehada. So does Hiruzen with Enma. Let's not use that. So I think that's probably what it's predicated on. If you want my opinion, I think the tandem interpretation is perfectly fine and acceptable. And I think that's a good way to go. So I actually think, and just due to Tobirama not playing around, there's a good case you could say he would actually clear the second round. But it is actually possible for the Kage to win depending on some of your presuppositions. So I don't think it's like an easy fight. I actually think this is like a high diff fight. But again, right, this is the same guy who's like teleporting clones and just grabbing truth-seeking spheres that are about to explode on Jubito. So is it really that much of a stretch? Probably not. Probably not. Next up, we have Minato. Now, Minato's cooking. I'm not gonna lie, like, Minato's similar to Tobirama, except he's just gonna do it on 10 with his standard arsenal of kunai. He's just gonna throw them everywhere against this battalion and just proceed to start cutting wood. Now, I know people are very iffy on Minato scaling. There's a couple of different interpretations. I'll start off by saying this. I don't think Minato scales to like the Raikage. I think he scales above. I think the Raikage statement about him being the fastest due to Minato's death is pretty blatant on that. the greatest in godlike speed. Even if you argue their encounter back in the day, the synopsis statement for the chapter literally notes Minato surpassing the 4th Raikage in speed. It's just pretty consistent, so nobody here is really going to be too fast for that. That makes sense. This coupled with body flicker is just going to make it so Minato has a fun time. He's just going to be cooking. I mean, and again, right, this is the same dude who, you know, a lot of people say he took down 1,000 shinobi. They're referring to like an anime scene with like Onoki and stuff like that. But in the manga, what they show is like him taking down 50 shinobi and stuff like that. But even then, right, if the markings are all everywhere, he's just going to be darting around way too much for anybody to really do anything. It's just going to kind of be free pickings for him in this situation. There really isn't anything to just discuss that crazy. The bigger question is Minato's AP in a similar situation to Tobirama, because I've like discussed it and gone over many translations. I think the Ninetales feat with Minato clashing with the Bijou Bomb is a pretty good one. Even if it's semi-formed and the Ninetales being held back by Kushina, we've seen off Six Tails Naruto what semi-transformed Bijou Bombs can do. Now, the counter argument that I could see to this is that, not that it's in a mindscape, because we know Minato actually did have to just like override and beat out the Ninetales chakra, otherwise Kushina would have gotten taken over. That's not the problem here. The problem here is that you have to argue the Bijou Bomb the Ninetales is forming is just scalable to like other minor variations, or if it was still in a stage where it's just chakra itself. Because we actually do know that when like the Ninetales is forming its Bijou Bomb, for example, and it gets sealed by Naruto, the chakra just dissipates. You know what I'm saying? It deforms. And on its own, it is just a heavy, dense chakra sphere. So even though I brought up that Six Tails Naruto example, I actually can see a case that this wouldn't be fully formed. You have Kushina's Uzumaki adamantine chains, obviously, you know, sealing everything in creation. Granted, I do think this feat generally still scales because of what I mentioned before, that if Minato did not win this chakra clash with like the small vestiges of a chakra that entered the Ninetales, Kushina would have gotten taken over. So the attack did have to be pretty strong. And if you go off like 4 Tails Naruto and 6 Tails Naruto as a metric, with this being actually a complete QB inside of Kushina, this would put him in pretty high ranges AP wise. Even if you didn't think, for example, he could damage Sage Mode Naruto, he would just wait out the Sage Mode timer, which is 5 minutes. Even if you argue Naruto Sage Mode does get better throughout the war, which is more so like later in the war when he's fighting against Obito, but if you grant it here and say he can hold it longer, it wouldn't be by that much of a like stretch, like that much longer or anything like that. So Minato would just wait that out and just teleport around. You know what I mean? It's pretty basic. Body flicker plus FTG just pretty much ensures that even if he does get grabbed, for whatever reason, it's pretty consistent that Minato just scales to his KCM2 levels of strength off of his statement to Naruto about Obito, with the Ninetales later reaffirming this when he actually takes control of Naruto and says it right back to Obito. Like, he sealed me. So it's seeded, then confirmed later on. So you kind of have like this KCM2 Naruto level threat. By the way, I'm not saying Minato beats KCM2 Naruto. I'm just saying this is the tier of fighter we're on, which pretty blatantly states like why he would just kind of dog everybody here. And once obviously Onoki, Gaara, or Naruto goes down, the rest of the shinobi really aren't going to be an issue. They were struggling against like far weaker Gokage, only really shown pressing like the 3rd Raikage in his base form. Next up, we have Minato versus the 5 Kage. Now, this is somewhat of a similar discussion to the Tobirama point. I think Minato would actually be more difficult to tag just because of how much more he can utilize FTG. And when I say that, I just mean he literally makes more markings. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Raikage has experience with FTG, so he actually may be a lot more useful in this encounter. He's like, all right, guys, the kunai are placed here, here, here. Keep that in mind. I can see something like that, but the problem is that the Raikage isn't really going to be able to sense like when Minato places a mark like he does on B. So if Minato actually does place a manual mark anywhere on the battlefield, he's always going to have that backdoor option to go. And that also goes with like a lot of the Tobirama stuff. If he gets a mark on any of the Kage, it's just kind of cooked. I will also say this, Edo Minato could be argued to be different than Hokage Minato. Now, I think Hokage Minato is different than Jonin Minato, but the whole thing with Edo Minato is that even though he's a little weaker, he actually does have half a QB, which you could argue enables like the QB to need chakra for him in his base form, which would just make him stronger. I'm also not throwing in QB Minato, just because like that's obvious. It's a stomp. I wouldn't really need to talk about that. I think base Edo Minato is much more of a discussion. But if you just wanted like a short-term answer, yeah, you know, you can go into QB mode, just wipe. There you go. If you argue he stays in base, I think there is a lot more of a similar discussion. Also, if you argue the AP point, again, it's pretty significant. I think you could argue he's faster, but he would actually struggle to permanently put the Kage down, and he would essentially need to push the fight into a point where he just fatigues them over. And again, he should be above the Raikage. There's also other ways to look at this. You know, the synopsis statement with Minato having unrivaled strength, which I brought up before, taking place throughout the duration of part 1, so that would kind of lend some semblance to this. If you guys want like my opinion on Minato, right, I'll just say this here, just like on the record. I think it's pretty clear where his narrative is. Naruto surpasses him when applying wind to the Rasen Shuriken. You can say he has stronger like hitting jutsu than Minato. Surpasses him in Sage 1 Mastery. Yes, Minato's a perfect Sage, but it's kind of dog shit. He can't maintain it for that long. And we also don't know how long he was charging it for. He surpasses Jonin Minato in like a level of speed with KCM1. KCM2, his speeds being like described to be similar to Hokage Minato. Then he utilizes the Nine Tails Chakra, controls it. He's set to surpass his parents for some time now. So that's kind of like my opinion where I kind of like go around Minato. And that doesn't mean like, oh, Minato's like hitting harder, like doing more than like what a KCM2 Bijou Bomb would do. But more so like these are the tiers of power like Minato kind of thought was needed to like take on somebody of like Obito's caliber, for example. If you want to argue Minato's beyond that, by all means, I think that's just a pretty consistent narrative. And you're kind of arguing like, okay, KCM2 levels of power versus the 5 Kage. It's not really a good look for the 5 Kage, you know what I mean? So a lot of similar stuff with Tobirama and Minato you can't argue. You know, you can argue their AP both ways. Although I do generally lean on Minato having better, like harder hitting jutsu, aside from maybe Tandem Paper Bombs with his Rasengan variants. With Minato generally being even harder to hit. So Minato should actually be able to clear these two. But I will say, again, it is a very high diff fight and it is debatable. And I know I keep coming back to like the long range particle style, but that's really the best option here to like make a giant cube amped by Tsunade and just, you know, encompass the FTG kunais, assuming the mark isn't there. And if you want to argue like, oh, Minato's Rasengan maybe won't be able to breach the Raikage's cloak if you don't subscribe to like the kunai thing, you know, cutting through the 8-tails tail. A good argument I've heard is that he teleports away, goes into Sage mode for like a quick AP amp in his jutsu, and then slams a Rasengan into the Kage if he wants a harder hitting technique, which I also think is pretty fair. But yeah, I think Minato does have a high diff fight here, especially assuming he's not playing around like Madara does. And if you don't want to argue base Minato, you know, I think that's fine. You would just say QB would also wipe by that extension. But I could see, again, of him and Tobirama, these are high diff fights. I do not want to like overstate it. They're not just going to try and do what Madara did, which was philosophically break down the Kage's ideology, specifically Tsunade's Will of Fire and Onoki, while allowing them to just slam jutsu into his Susanoo and just like ram against it. Pause again. Which is an very character thing to do. He even notes this against the Kage. He's testing them out. So this probably wouldn't be happening here. Next up, we have Hashirama, which is a wipe. I'm not going to talk about this. Madara could have wiped. Hashirama's going to wipe. That should be pretty clear. Don't really got to say too much on that. I think a similar thing applies to like Hokage Naruto. I should not need explanations on this. I'm going to be honest. If I do, I honestly don't know what to tell you. Now, normally I would do like Hokage Shikamaru and Hokage Kakashi, but I've done that on 2 separate videos. My Hokage versus Itachi and Pain videos. I'll leave those down below. Click on screen or something if you want to go see those. But I would literally be making the same arguments and just like rehashing information for the sake of watch time. So I'm not going to do that. If you want to hear the, like why those characters or where they would scale in relation to all of this, just check those videos out so I don't have to repeat myself. It becomes monotonous. We'll both be happy. Honorable mention in this video is also Danzo. I'll say this. I don't think Danzo clears the first round because what you need to understand is, right, Danzo physically is a rival to like 5 Kage Summit Sasuke outside the Susanoo. Like there's times where he's able to contend with him, weave out of his Chidori attacks, place a marker on him, and even at one point just dodge his Susanoo arm. But it is pretty established that the Susanoo is just, did I just say that 2 different ways, like in the same sentence? What's wrong with me? But yeah, that was the reason why Sasuke was spamming it in the fight, just to kill Danzo over and over and over. So Danzo actually comes in a little lacking in the stat category here. I actually can't lie. He might... Here's the thing, right? It's kind of weird to discuss how like an Edo Tensei would do with Izanagi, and if Danzo would even get revived with that arm, you know, intact. But here's the problem with it, right? Here's the problem with fundamentally Danzo activating Izanagi and why it kills him in this matchup. Even if you argue he activates it, he's going to be lowering his time limit for the round 2 gauntlet because they're going to be connected, right? So even if he does like deactivate the jutsu like we see he does, and that's like why he also gets graced in the shoulder by Sasuke powering up, he still would start the fight against the 5 Kage with less eyes, with a total timer of 10 minutes. So I ask you this, Do you think that Danzo could solo this division and the 5 Kage in 10 minutes? Probably not, right? Probably not, you know? And we do know when Edo Tensei activate these jutsu like Izanagi and Izanami, they do lose vision in those eyes. So even if I did grant you the Izanagi arm, which may be questionable if he even revives with it because it's like a modification on his body as opposed to just like this natural thing he died with. And if you're going to argue Madara, Kabuto specifically messed with his corpse, whereas Danzo's enhancements were all unnatural while he was alive. So he may not even be revived with it. It would become very apparent very quickly that Danzo's just reviving via Izanagi. And even though his Izanagi revivals can't really be sensed or predicted, as even Kennen can't do it, he still just wouldn't be able to like overwhelm everybody here within that time frame. Kodo also isn't as relevant here because even though it could make like that subtle suggestion for someone not to do an option and stuff like that, all that means is that he wouldn't be able to use it in the next round. You know what I mean? So on top of Danzo's stats not really being present to like really be able to perform off like kind of like the W I was describing for some other characters, he probably would give the Shinobi division a pretty big amount of trouble because you could argue he would actually fatigue the Sage Mode Naruto clone out of his Rasen Shurikens and actually make him pop. Maybe fatigue Onoki out of some particle styles. If he gets sealed, he'll just reappear. But again, right, at the end of all that, he's still going to have to fight the 5 Kage. And it's like, you know, I mentioned before, Danzo's not beating the 5 Kage solo. It's actually pretty implied that he's below Hiruzen. Now, you could argue politically, but the novel also does supplement this. So, you know, take what you will. So, I think Danzo would actually do pretty well round 1. But generally, you know, there's no real future for him in this, like, kind of matchup. That's the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Fun little discussion. Let me know your thoughts down below. All that good stuff. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.